On my 69th birthday, instead of candles, laughter, and the warmth of those who should have been by my side, I received words sharper than any knife. They didn't come from strangers. They came from the very people who had once relied on me for everything, people who should have known my worth better than anyone else. "You're just in the way," they said, their voices dripping with impatience. "It's better if you leave quietly." The words echoed in my ears like a verdict, final and merciless, as though my life's value could be reduced to an inconvenience. I didn't shout back. I didn't defend myself. I simply lowered my gaze, hid my trembling hands, and walked away with the dignity they thought they had stripped from me. What they didn't know was that beneath my silence lay the greatest secret of all. In my possession was the deed to everything they held dear. The air that day felt heavier than usual, as if the world itself had paused to witness my humiliation. I could see the faint smirks, the turned heads, the way they couldn't even look me in the eye as they dismissed me. To them, I was old, irrelevant, and disposable. They thought they were pushing me aside, cleaning up space for themselves. But in truth, every word, every action, was carving a deeper wound, yet at the same time, it was fueling a fire inside me that they would one day regret igniting. I had lived my entire life in service to others. I had worked tirelessly, given my best years to build something from nothing, sacrificed sleep, health, and joy so that others could thrive. Yet, in that moment, all those sacrifices were erased in their eyes, overshadowed by a single perception: I was no longer useful. I was in the way. And when people decide you're no longer useful, they don't hesitate to cast you aside. That is the cruelty of ego, the blindness of greed, and the arrogance of youth. But I had learned, through every hardship and betrayal, that silence can be more powerful than words. And so, I walked away. What they didn't realize was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. My stillness wasn't weakness, it was patience. Because the papers tucked away in my worn leather folder, the ones they had forgotten even existed, held the truth that would shift the ground beneath their feet. While they laughed at my back, congratulating themselves for finally getting rid of me, I carried with me the keys to their empire. They thought they had won. They had no idea the game had only just begun. I remember the coldness in their voices, the smugness in their tone, the way they treated me as if I were a burden to be carried. But I also remember the strength it took not to reveal my hand too soon. That strength wasn't born overnight, it was the product of decades of resilience, of knowing how to endure storms without breaking. And on that day, when I left quietly with my head high, I wasn't defeated. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would rise, and every single one of them would have to look me in the eyes and realize the cost of underestimating me. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't loud or violent. Sometimes the greatest revenge is the quiet walk away. When you know you hold all the power they believe is theirs. The night after I was told to leave, I sat alone in my room with nothing but the dim glow of a lamp and the silence of my own breath. The humiliation replayed in my mind like an endless reel. Every word, every gesture, every dismissive glance was etched into me. They thought I had walked away defeated, a woman stripped of value, forgotten and irrelevant. But as the hours passed, what began as pain hardened into resolve. I realized that silence is not emptiness, it is space. Space to gather strength, space to wait, space to let others underestimate you until it's too late for them to undo the mistake. For days, I carried myself as if nothing had changed. I went through the motions quietly, and in that quiet, I saw everything more clearly than ever before. I noticed how they moved, how they celebrated my absence, how they spoke loudly about their plans now that I was finally out of the way. They filled the rooms with their voices, their egos swelling, blind to the truth that I was listening, learning, and preparing. They thought they had silenced me, but in reality, they had handed me the perfect opportunity to watch them reveal their weaknesses, their greed, and their blindness. The papers, the deed they had long forgotten about, rested safely in my possession. It wasn't just a document. It was my shield, my weapon, and my redemption. It was the culmination of years of sacrifices they never saw, of struggles they dismissed, of late nights and early mornings when I had carried the weight they refused to shoulder. Every word on that paper was proof that my silence was not weakness, it was power in its purest form. I remembered the times I had gone hungry so others could eat, the nights I stayed awake worrying about bills while they slept peacefully, oblivious to the sacrifices I made. I remembered the birthdays I had ignored, the dreams I had shelved, the laughter I had swallowed, all for their comfort. And now, after everything, they had dared to call me in the way. That insult didn't just cut, it branded itself into me, igniting a fire I hadn't felt in years. Yet I didn't explode. I didn't confront. I didn't shout. I did something far more terrifying. I waited. I let them think they had won. I let them dance in the illusion of their own victory, parading around as if they had finally rid themselves of the burden that was me. Their arrogance became my camouflage. Their greed became my weapon. The louder they laughed, the quieter I became. And in that quiet, I held all the cards. There's a strange kind of power in being underestimated. It gives you the freedom to move without scrutiny, to breathe without pressure, to act when no one is watching. While they turned their backs, I was already thinking 10 steps ahead. I was already imagining the day they would stand before me, their faces pale, their voices trembling, when they realized the truth, that the deed they ignored, the woman they dismissed, was the very foundation of their empire. Without me, there was nothing. With me, everything could change. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how blind they had been, how easily people discard others when they believe they no longer serve a purpose. That blindness was their downfall, and I had no intention of correcting it. Let them laugh. Let them sneer. Let them celebrate. Every smile, every dismissive word was another nail in the coffin of their own arrogance. I didn't need to fight them now. I only needed to wait until the right moment, when truth would strike like lightning and shatter the false sense of security they clung to. And so, I stayed in the shadows, quiet but unbroken. I observed, I listened, I remembered. I thought of all the years they had taken me for granted, all the times they had leaned on me without acknowledgement, all the moments they had dismissed my sacrifices as obligations rather than choices. Those memories didn't weaken me, they sharpened me. They reminded me that I wasn't the one who had failed. They were. They had failed to see the person who had built everything they depended on, the one who held the deed they so carelessly ignored. As the days turned into weeks, my silence became heavier, almost tangible. They noticed less and less of me until it was as if I were invisible. And invisibility to them was proof of their power. To me, it was the perfect disguise. Because when the day came for the truth to emerge, their shock would be all the more devastating. Sometimes the most dangerous storms are the ones that build quietly, without thunder or lightning, until the moment they break with a force no one saw coming. I was that storm. They thought I had vanished, that I was powerless, that I had been erased. But I was simply gathering strength, holding on to the truth they didn't know, waiting for the perfect moment to remind them that the woman they had kicked aside was the one who held their future in her hands. And when that day arrived, their arrogance would crumble, their laughter would die in their throats, and the silence they once mocked would become the sound of their undoing. So tell me, if you were cast aside, called useless, and left to disappear, would you remain silent? Or would you wait for the perfect moment to show them that the power they thought was theirs was yours all along? I often look back at the years that shaped me, not with regret, but with the deep ache of someone who knows just how much was poured into others without a second thought for myself. Those years carried weight, not the kind you can see on shoulders, but the kind that buries itself inside your bones, in sleepless nights and days stretched thin between obligations and the quiet despair of never being enough. People see the gray in my hair, the lines on my face, and they think they tell the story of age, but they do not know the truth. Those lines are maps of sacrifice, etched by years of labor, devotion, and choices that always placed others ahead of me. I remember when my children were small, and I would stay up long after they had gone to bed. The kitchen table became my office, my battlefield, my sanctuary. Bills spread before me, numbers refusing to add up no matter how many times I recalculated. I would sip weak coffee just to stay awake, my body begging for rest. But I pushed through because I knew if I faltered, the whole structure of our lives would crumble. While others slept peacefully, I carried the invisible burden of keeping everything intact. The mornings came early, the alarm dragging me from the shallowest of sleep. My body ached, but there was no room for weakness. I had mouths to feed, a roof to protect, and futures to secure. My hands scrubbed floors, folded laundry, cooked meals, and later typed reports, answered phones, carried boxes, whatever was needed to keep the income steady. I never asked for applause, and I rarely received thanks. But I believed in something larger. The hope that one day, all my sacrifices would mean something, that those I worked so hard for would remember not only what I gave them, but also who I was. But hope can be cruel, because when the years passed and my hair grew silver, instead of gratitude, I was met with dismissal. Instead of being seen as the foundation, I was told I was in the way. They looked at me and saw only age, weakness, a body slowing down. They didn't see the decades of work that had built their comfort. They didn't remember the times I went without shoes so they could have new ones for school, the nights I pretended not to be hungry so they could have seconds at dinner, the dreams I never chased so theirs could have a chance to fly. They erased it all with a single phrase: "You're no longer needed." That is the cruelty of people. They measure your worth by what you can still give them, not by what you've already sacrificed. And yet, those sacrifices were not small. They were mountains climbed in silence, storms endured without complaint. They were the currency of love, paid without ever asking for repayment. I bled into the soil of their futures, believing they would honor me when the time came. Instead, they dismissed me, forgetting that the roots of any tree cannot be cut without killing the branches. I think of the nights when my body broke down, nights when the world was asleep and I sat on the edge of my bed, massaging my aching legs, tears slipping quietly down my face because I didn't want anyone to hear me cry. Pain was my companion, but silence was my armor, and I wore that armor well. They never knew how much I endured because I never wanted them to feel the weight I carried. But that invisibility became a curse. The more I hid my struggles, the easier it became for them to pretend I had none. And yet, I endured. For them. Always for them. Now, to stand in the aftermath of those sacrifices, to hear them say I was nothing but in the way, was a betrayal that pierced deeper than any wound I had ever suffered. It was not just disrespect, it was the erasure of my entire life's work. They discarded me as though the years of sacrifice had vanished into thin air. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every one of those sacrifices had built something greater than their narrow eyes could comprehend. They thought I had lost everything, but in truth, I had gained the one thing that mattered: power hidden in plain sight, written on a deed they had forgotten existed. It is easy to underestimate someone who carries themselves quietly, who does not shout, who does not demand recognition. But those are often the people carrying the heaviest loads. Those are the people whose strength you only see when it's too late. I was one of them. And they will come to learn that the years I gave them were not years wasted, they were years invested. And the return on that investment is something they cannot begin to measure. Sacrifice, when ignored, does not disappear. It hardens, it transforms, it becomes the fire that fuels the next chapter. And as they laughed at my absence, as they congratulated themselves for pushing me aside, I stood taller in silence, knowing that the weight of my years was not a burden but a foundation. They built their world on me, and soon they would discover that I was no longer just the backbone. I was the owner. So I ask you, if you had given everything, your time, your health, your dreams for those who later discarded you, would you forgive their blindness? Or would you let the weight of your sacrifices speak louder than words? Humiliation has a sound. It is not the sharpness of a slap or the crack of thunder. It is quieter, more insidious. It is the laughter you are not meant to hear but cannot avoid. It is the whisper that silences a room when you enter, the sudden cough meant to mask cruel words, the smirk that fades the moment you turn your head. On the day they humiliated me, I heard every sound, every murmur, every false cough. I felt their eyes cut into me like blades, judging, dismissing, stripping me of worth with glances sharp enough to wound. I walked into that room as I had 1,000 times before, with shoulders squared and my head high. My hands still carried the faint ache of decades of work, but they also carried a quiet pride, the kind that comes from surviving storms most would crumble beneath. But that day, the pride I carried was drowned beneath the wave of humiliation. It began subtly, a chair pulled away so I had nowhere to sit, a sigh too loud to be accidental, an exaggerated glance at the clock as if my presence were an inconvenience. Then came the words, "You're just in the way." 4 words, 4 blades, spoken not as an apology, not even as frustration, but as a declaration, as if they had rehearsed it, waited for the right moment to wound me in front of everyone. The room went still, and then the whispers began, a chorus of cowardice. No one stood for me. No one spoke in my defense. They watched, eyes darting, some with pity, others with smug satisfaction, and I realized in that instant that humiliation is not only in the words spoken but in the silence that follows. Silence is agreement. Silence is complicity. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout every truth I carried, every sacrifice I had made, every night I had stayed awake while they slept, every meal I had given up so they could eat, every dream I had buried to keep theirs alive. I wanted to throw it in their faces, to demand acknowledgement, to force them to see me. But my throat refused to open. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with fury restrained by something stronger than anger, dignity. They expected me to crumble, to lash out, to confirm their narrative that I was weak, fragile, a burden. But instead, I did what they could never understand. I endured in silence. The sting of humiliation is unlike any other. Pain fades, wounds heal, but humiliation lingers, echoing in your chest long after the moment has passed. That day, every fiber of my being felt smaller, as though I were shrinking before their eyes. My hands shook, not because I was afraid, but because I was holding back the storm inside me. My silence was not weakness, it was control. Every word I did not speak, every tear I did not shed in their presence, was a choice. And in that choice, I discovered something they could never take from me: power. The irony was bitter. They looked at me and saw someone who had no fight left, someone too old, too tired, too irrelevant to matter. But in my silence, I held more strength than their words could ever hold. They mistook my quiet for surrender, but it was strategy. Humiliation, after all, is only temporary when the truth rests in your hands. And in my hands, hidden safely away, was the deed that would one day erase every smirk, every whisper, every insult they had dared to throw at me. As I stood there, absorbing their cruelty, my mind wandered through memories. I remembered being a young woman, enduring the same dismissive tones, the same rolled eyes, the same cruel laughter when I dared to dream beyond my place. I remembered swallowing those humiliations too, because I knew that life is not always about winning every battle. Sometimes it is about choosing which battles are worth your voice and which are worth your silence. That day, I chose silence, not because I accepted their words, but because I was saving my voice for the moment it would matter most. Humiliation teaches you things pride cannot. It teaches you how to bend without breaking, how to withstand storms that others cannot, how to let people underestimate you until the moment you rise and their shock is greater than their insult ever was. As they laughed and sneered, I held on to that lesson. I let them think they had won, let them believe their words had buried me. They didn't know that in burying me, they were planting the seed of their own downfall. When you are humiliated publicly, you face a choice. You can let the moment define you, or you can let it sharpen you. I chose the latter. My silence was my weapon, my shield, my dignity wrapped in restraint. And though they believed they had stripped me of everything, the truth was that they had given me something more powerful than respect. They had given me clarity. I saw them for who they truly were: fragile, arrogant, blind to the storm gathering in the silence they mocked. Humiliation does not destroy those who know their worth. It only delays their rise. And I knew, as I walked away that day with their laughter at my back, that the moment of my rise was coming. So I ask you, if you stood in front of a room full of people and were humiliated, would you fight back with words, or would you hold your silence, knowing that one day your truth would roar louder than their mockery? Power does not always arrive in a grand moment, with trumpets and flashing lights. Sometimes it lives in shadows, hidden in plain sight, waiting quietly to be revealed. While they laughed at me, dismissed me, and pushed me aside as if I were nothing more than clutter in the way of their ambitions, I carried within me the most dangerous weapon of all: knowledge they did not possess and papers they had long forgotten existed. The seeds of power had been planted years before, watered with sacrifice, and protected by the patience that only someone who has endured a lifetime of trials can understand. I would often sit at my small desk, the one no one paid attention to, and touch the worn edges of the leather folder where the deed was kept. To them, it was just another envelope, buried beneath years of paperwork they had discarded and ignored. But to me, it was life. It was justice. It was my silent reminder that while they saw me as disposable, I was holding the very foundation of their world. Every time I brushed my fingers across that folder, I could almost feel the weight of destiny in my hands. They believed I had nothing left to give, no voice to raise, no influence to command. But what they didn't realize was that influence is not always loud. Influence is quiet, patient, deliberate. It waits. And I was waiting. I let them sneer, let them gloat, let them toss their arrogance into the air as though it would never fall back down. They never once stopped to consider that the woman they had deemed irrelevant was the same woman who could end their empire with a single signature. The irony was sharp and almost sweet. The very people who thought themselves powerful were blind to the truth that their entire authority rested in my hands. They strutted and preened, showing off their supposed dominance, while I sat silently, a storm disguised as a whisper. It is a strange kind of pleasure to know something others do not, to carry a secret so immense that it could alter the course of everything. That folder was not just paper, it was thunder in waiting, lightning bottled up, a storm ready to break. I remembered the day I had received it, the day the former owner, someone who had seen my loyalty, my integrity, my unbreakable resilience, handed me the keys to everything. His eyes had been tired, but his voice had been steady. "You're the only one I trust," he had said. At the time, I thought it was an honor, a gift of trust. Only later did I realize it was also a shield, a safeguard against the very arrogance that now stood before me, mocking me without realizing they were standing on soil I owned. They dismissed me, yet they were building their future on my foundation. They ignored me, yet every step they took echoed on the floorboards of my property. They called me in the way, but it was my name on the deed that allowed them to exist in that space at all. That was the bitter comedy of it all: their empire, their authority, their power. It was all an illusion built upon my silence. The more they flaunted their superiority, the more patient I became. Because patience is not the absence of action, it is the preparation for the right action. I was not passive, I was deliberate. I knew that revealing my hand too soon would rob me of the satisfaction, the justice, the undeniable proof that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power. Every time they rolled their eyes at me, every time they sighed at my presence, every time they whispered behind my back, I would smile faintly, not because their cruelty didn't hurt, but because I knew something they didn't. That knowledge was my armor, and it kept me standing tall while they tried to bend me low. And there is something intoxicating about carrying that kind of secret power. It makes you see the world differently. You stop being the victim, even if they believe you are. You stop being powerless, even if they think you have no voice. You stop being invisible, even if they choose not to see you. Because in truth, you are none of those things. You are the center of it all, and they will one day learn it in the most dramatic way possible. The seeds of power are not loud. They do not announce themselves. They sit quietly in the soil of injustice, watered by patience, nurtured by silence, and fed by time. And when the moment comes, they sprout not as flowers, but as storms, uncontrollable, undeniable, unstoppable. That was what I was carrying inside me. A storm disguised as a seed. They thought they had buried me, but in truth, they had only planted me deeper. And the day of my rise would be the day they realized the cost of their arrogance. So let me ask you, if you carried in your hands the very deed to the future of those who mocked and dismissed you, would you reveal it immediately? Or would you let the seeds of your power grow quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to watch their arrogance collapse under the weight of your truth? The breaking point doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps into your life slowly, disguised as sighs you ignore, glances you brush off, whispers you pretend not to hear. It begins with small cuts, moments that sting but that you convince yourself you can survive. But eventually, those cuts bleed into one another, until you find yourself drowning in winds no one else can see. My breaking point came in a room filled with laughter. The kind of laughter that sounds warm from the outside, but, to the one being mocked, feels like knives thrown at your back. They had gathered for another meeting, the kind that was less about progress and more about flaunting their importance. I sat quietly in my corner, as I always did, my presence reduced to background noise in their world of inflated egos. I had grown accustomed to their dismissive glances, their exaggerated sighs whenever I dared to speak, their patronizing nods when they wanted me to feel as though I still mattered. But that day, something in the air was different. That day, the cruelty sharpened into something undeniable. It began with a joke, my name, twisted and thrown across the room like a toy, followed by bursts of laughter. They didn't even lower their voices anymore. To them, I was no longer a person. I was an object, a relic, something to ridicule and discard. And as their laughter echoed off the walls, I felt the sting of every sacrifice I had made rise within me, screaming for recognition. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer force of everything I had held back for too long. For years, I had swallowed humiliation, telling myself dignity came from endurance. I had believed that silence was strength, that waiting for the right moment was wisdom. But that day, as their laughter grew louder, I felt something crack inside me. It was not weakness, it was awakening. Because the truth is, everyone has a breaking point. A moment when the dam holding back years of pain, sacrifice, and betrayal finally bursts. And when mine did, it wasn't with tears or screams. It was with clarity. I looked at their faces, smug, careless, blinded by arrogance, and I realized something powerful. They weren't mocking me because I was weak. They were mocking me because they feared what they could not control. They wanted to erase me because, deep down, they knew the truth. They knew I had endured more than they could ever comprehend. They knew I was still standing, despite everything. And nothing terrifies arrogant people more than the quiet strength of someone they tried and failed to break. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, their words no longer cut. Their laughter no longer stung. Instead, it fueled me. It lit a fire in my chest that turned humiliation into power. I no longer heard insults, I heard confessions. Every cruel joke was proof of their insecurity. Every dismissive glance was proof of their blindness. Every whisper was proof of their weakness. And in that moment, I understood that my silence was no longer just endurance, it was strategy. Because the breaking point is not just about collapse. It is about transformation. I sat there, hands folded calmly, my face betraying none of the storm inside me. To them, I was still the same invisible woman, but inside, I was reborn. I no longer saw myself as the victim of their cruelty. I saw myself as the architect of their downfall. Every insult they hurled at me was another brick I laid in the foundation of the justice that was coming. Every laugh was another spark in the fire they would one day regret igniting. They thought they were tearing me down, but they were only sharpening me, preparing me for the moment when silence would end and truth would roar. When you reach your breaking point, you realize something vital. You have nothing left to lose. And in that freedom, you discover a power greater than any insult, greater than any humiliation. I was no longer afraid of their words, because I knew something they didn't. I knew I had the deed. I knew I had the power. I knew that every cruel act they committed was bringing them closer to the day when their laughter would choke in their throats. So I endured, not because I was weak, but because I was strong enough to wait. I let them think they had broken me, let them believe their cruelty had silenced me. But inside, I was standing taller than ever before. My breaking point had not destroyed me, it had revealed me. And when the time came, they would see exactly what that meant. Because the truth is, breaking does not always mean shattering. Sometimes it means breaking free from fear, from humiliation, from silence. Sometimes it means stepping into the power you were always meant to wield. And that is what they would never understand. The woman they thought they had humiliated into dust was the same woman who would one day stand before them as their equal, no longer hidden, no longer silent, no longer ignored. I had crossed the threshold. There was no going back. Their laughter no longer defined me. My silence no longer chained me. I was free, and freedom is the most dangerous weapon of all. So I ask you, when you reach your breaking point, do you collapse under the weight of humiliation, or do you rise from it, stronger, sharper, ready to turn every insult into the weapon that will one day set you free? Revelations rarely arrive when the world is ready to hear them. They come like storms, uninvited and unstoppable, exposing truths that arrogance tried so desperately to bury. For me, the revelation wasn't just about paperwork or signatures, it was about power, dignity, and the undeniable justice of watching the scales finally balance. I had carried the secret for years, hidden beneath silence, beneath endurance, beneath every insult they had hurled my way. And when the moment came, it wasn't rage that guided me. It was clarity. That morning felt ordinary to everyone else. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm of phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and footsteps echoing against polished floors. They strutted through the halls, voices dripping with authority they believed was theirs to keep forever. They smirked when they saw me, some rolling their eyes, others whispering under their breath. To them, I was still the same burden, still the one in the way. What they didn't realize was that this was the last day their arrogance would ever matter. The folder rested in my hands, its edges worn from the countless times I had opened it in private, reminding myself of the truth I carried. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. It was not about vengeance, it was about unveiling what was always mine. As I stepped into the conference room, the very place where they had mocked me countless times, I felt a calmness settle over me. This was not humiliation's stage anymore. This was justice's arena. The meeting began with their usual pompous speeches. Voices rose, filled with self-importance, dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from believing no one can challenge you. They dismissed me with a glance, assuming I was there to take notes, to sit silently as they flaunted their supposed brilliance. But when I stood, slowly and deliberately, the room shifted. Silence rippled through their arrogance, the kind of silence that carries confusion, unease, even fear. I placed the folder on the table, sliding the deed across the polished wood. Their smirks faltered, their laughter stuttered. I watched as confusion turned to disbelief, disbelief to panic. One of them picked up the papers, scanning them with trembling hands, his voice cracking as he read the words aloud. My name, my ownership, my authority. The very empire they believed belonged to them was, in truth, mine. The room erupted. Voices rose, overlapping, filled with denial and protest. This can't be real. There must be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Their arrogance had blinded them to the truth that had been right in front of them all along. And I, the woman they had ridiculed, dismissed, and humiliated, was now revealed as the rightful owner. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to defend myself. The papers spoke louder than any words could. Every signature, every stamp, every line of ink was a testament to my authority. Their power crumbled before their eyes, and in that moment, I realized something profound. The greatest revenge is not anger. It is revelation. It is the unveiling of truth so undeniable that even your enemies are forced to choke on it. Their faces were a gallery of emotions: shock, disbelief, fear, and beneath it all, the dawning realization that they had mocked the very person who now held their futures in her hands. Some lowered their heads, shame flickering in their eyes. Others still tried to bluster, their voices loud but hollow, as if volume could erase reality. But no sound could compete with the weight of that revelation. And as I stood there, calm and composed, I felt decades of humiliation lift from my shoulders. The silence I had carried for so long had finally spoken. The sacrifices, the nights of pain, the years of invisibility, all of it converged into this moment of truth. I was no longer the forgotten one. I was the foundation. I was the owner. It is a strange thing to hold so much power after being treated as though you had none. It does not feel like revenge, it feels like justice. Long delayed but finally delivered. They had written me off, erased me from their narrative. And yet here I was, rewriting the story with my name etched in permanence. And here is the truth I carried with me in that moment. Revelation is not just about proving others wrong. It is about reminding yourself of who you always were, even when they tried to strip it from you. They had called me weak, invisible, irrelevant. But the revelation proved otherwise. It proved that endurance is not weakness, it is strategy. That silence is not submission, it is patience. That dignity, no matter how overlooked, always wins in the end. As the room sat in stunned silence, I looked at them one last time and realized something that made me smile, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. They had never truly known me. They had only known the version of me they wanted to see. And that blindness was their downfall. So I ask you, if you had the chance to reveal a truth that would shatter the arrogance of those who humiliated you, would you seize it immediately? Or would you wait, letting the weight of the revelation crash down at the perfect moment, ensuring it could never be ignored? Power is a strange thing. For those who cling to it desperately, it feels eternal, unshakable, as though the throne they sit upon was built from stone. But power is never permanent, it is fluid, fragile, always waiting for the right moment to change hands. And when it shifts, it does not ask permission. It does not knock quietly at the door. It crashes in like a storm, sweeping away arrogance, pride, and entitlement in one devastating gust. That was what I witnessed the moment the truth of my ownership settled into the room. The revelation had stunned them, but the shift was something different entirely. It was not just a shock of discovery, it was the recognition of defeat. I saw it in their eyes, in the way their shoulders sank, in the tremor of voices that once dripped with condescension but now cracked with uncertainty. The men and women who had mocked me, who had treated me as if my very presence was a nuisance, now looked at me with a kind of reluctant awe, mingled with fear. They were realizing, perhaps for the first time, that power had left their hands and settled firmly into mine. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. No one dared to laugh. No one dared to whisper. Even the air itself seemed to stand still, waiting to see what I would do next. It was as though the walls themselves had turned to witnesses, eager to watch the empire of arrogance crumble before their eyes. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to prove anything with speeches or declarations. The deed on the table spoke louder than any words could. The ink on that paper carried more weight than the decades of arrogance they had flaunted. And as they stared at it, I could see the shift taking place not just in the room, but in their very souls. Some tried to recover quickly. One man, his face flushed red with anger, slammed his hand on the table. "This changes nothing," he shouted, his voice shaking. But his words betrayed him. His eyes darted nervously toward me, as though waiting for my reaction, as though knowing deep down that everything had already changed. Another woman tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle, hollow, breaking apart before it even reached the air. No thought could hold against the reality pressing down on them. It was then that I realized something profound. Power is not just about possession. It is about perception. And in that room, their perception of me had shifted completely. I was no longer the invisible one. I was no longer the burden, the nuisance, the afterthought. I was the owner, the foundation beneath their empire, the one they had underestimated, ignored, humiliated until it was too late. Their arrogance collapsed like a house of cards, and I felt no need to gloat. Justice does not require arrogance, it requires truth. And the truth was undeniable. Every insult, every dismissive glance, every cruel word they had spoken now echoed back at them with a weight they could not carry. They had mocked the very person who now controlled their futures. And the irony was almost poetic. I watched them struggle with the realization, their faces shifting through disbelief, fear, anger, and finally, resignation. The shift of power was not gentle, it was brutal, merciless, and absolute. They had lost everything in an instant, not because I had taken it from them, but because they had given it away long ago when they underestimated me. Underestimation is the most fatal mistake the powerful can make, and they had made it willingly, eagerly, repeatedly until it became their downfall. And me? I stood there calm, silent, almost serene. I did not need their validation. I did not need their apologies. Their recognition or lack thereof meant nothing to me now, because the truth had spoken louder than any of their cruelty ever could. For years, they had controlled the narrative, but now the pen was in my hand. And with a single stroke of truth, the story had changed forever. The shift of power is not always explosive. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is nothing more than the sound of a paper sliding across a table, the sound of silence replacing laughter, the sound of arrogance crumbling beneath the weight of truth. That was all it took, and in that silence, I saw my dignity rise higher than it ever had before. They looked at me differently now, not as an object of ridicule, but as the undeniable center of the room. Even their anger betrayed respect, because anger is always a mask for fear. And I knew, in that moment, that they feared me not for who I was, but for the truth I carried, the power they had never thought I possessed. The balance had shifted, and there was no turning it back. They could protest, deny, argue all they wanted, but the truth had already cemented itself. Their empire was no longer theirs. It was mine. And the greatest irony was that I hadn't taken it through force, through manipulation, or through deceit. I had simply waited. I had endured. I had let them bury me in humiliation until they forgot that seeds grow best when buried deep. And now, here I was, no longer the seed but the tree, towering above the very ones who thought they had silenced me forever. So I ask you, if the balance of power suddenly shifted into your hands after years of humiliation, would you show mercy? Or would you let the weight of truth remind them of everything they tried to take from you? The room was still heavy with silence, the kind that only follows the collapse of arrogance. Their eyes avoided mine, darting instead to the papers on the table, as if staring long enough might undo the truth inked upon them. But truth cannot be erased by denial. It lingers, it echoes, it demands to be acknowledged. And in that moment, I realized the shift of power was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of something deeper. The revelation had changed their perception, but the echo of it would change their lives. They whispered among themselves, voices low and urgent, scrambling for explanations, excuses, ways to salvage dignity that had already slipped through their fingers. Some paced, some clenched their fists, some looked at me with eyes that begged for mercy they had never once offered me. And as I stood in the center of their chaos, I felt no need to raise my voice. My silence was louder than their panic. My calmness was more commanding than their frantic noise. It struck me then. This was the moral echo. The moment when cruelty finally meets consequence, when arrogance finally confronts humility, when those who once laughed are forced to taste the bitterness of their own scorn. It was not my voice that reminded them of what they had done, it was the weight of their own actions reverberating back at them, magnified by the truth they had tried to bury. For years they had painted me as invisible, irrelevant, disposable. And yet, here I was, the sole figure in the room they could not ignore. Every insult they had spoken echoed now, not in my ears, but in theirs. Every dismissive glance, every cruel word, every mocking laugh, it all came rushing back to them, haunting them with the undeniable proof that the foundation of their empire was never theirs to begin with. The echo of their cruelty became their judgment, and I did not need to say a word. I could see the weight pressing down on them. The strongest among them fidgeted nervously, his confidence crumbling into stammered protests. Another, who once prided herself on her sharp tongue, sat in silence, her lips pressed tightly together as if she feared speaking might shatter what little pride she had left. They were unraveling, not because I demanded it, but because truth has a way of stripping away illusions more brutally than any revenge could. And yet, amid their collapse, I felt something unexpected rise within me. Not joy, not triumph, but clarity. The moral echo was not just for them, it was for me. It was a reminder that endurance had not been wasted, that patience had not been weakness, that silence had not been surrender. Every moment of humiliation I had endured was now transformed into strength, proof that dignity cannot be destroyed by mockery. It can only be hidden until the right time. I remembered the nights I had cried in silence, the mornings I had forced myself to walk into the building knowing what awaited me. I remembered the whispers, the laughter, the constant reminders that I was not wanted. And now, standing in the same place where they had tried to break me, I realized that those very experiences were the stones that built the foundation of this moment. They thought they had diminished me, but in truth, they had prepared me. They had made me stronger, sharper, unshakable. That is the essence of the moral echo. What you send into the world will always return to you, amplified. Their cruelty had returned as their downfall. My endurance had returned as my strength. And now, as they squirmed in their seats, unsure of how to face me, I understood that I no longer needed their apologies or their recognition. The echo itself was enough. But here is the truth they could not yet grasp. This was not about revenge. It was about justice, about balance, about the undeniable law that no arrogance lasts forever. They had treated me as though I was in the way, but now they were forced to reckon with the reality that I had been the way all along. Without me, there was no foundation. Without me, there was no company. Without me, there was no future. And though they didn't realize it yet, the echo of this moment would follow them long after the meeting ended. Every time they entered that building, they would remember the day the walls themselves seemed to turn against them. Every time they saw my face, they would remember the silence that spoke louder than their insults ever could. Every decision they made from this day forward would be shadowed by the knowledge that their arrogance had been their undoing. As for me, I felt no need to gloat, no desire to bask in their discomfort. The true victory was not in their downfall, but in my rise. The echo was not a reminder of their cruelty, it was a reminder of my resilience. And that resilience was something no one could ever take away from me again. So I stood, calm and unshaken, while they wrestled with the weight of their actions. The moral echo was theirs to carry now, not mine. I had lived with it long enough. And now I turn to you. If those who mocked you, dismissed you, and humiliated you were suddenly forced to face the echo of their cruelty, would you forgive them, or would you let the echo remind them, again and again, of the cost of underestimating you? There are moments in life when you are forced to choose between becoming bitter from the wounds inflicted upon you, or rising with a faith that no wound can erase. Standing there, watching the same people who had once mocked me tremble in the shadow of their own arrogance, I understood that the true test was never theirs, it had always been mine. Could I carry my pain with dignity? Could I hold on to faith when the world tried to strip it from me? Could I believe in a future where justice would find its way back to me, even when every sign pointed to despair. The answer, though slow and painful, was yes. Faith is not born in comfort. It is born in struggle, in long nights where silence feels like betrayal, in days where you wonder if your sacrifices have meant anything at all. It grows when people turn their backs on you, when humiliation echoes louder than encouragement, when you stand alone and still choose to stand. My journey had been filled with humiliation, but it was in those moments of loneliness that I discovered the quiet voice within me that refused to be broken. That voice was faith, whispering that every tear, every insult, every sacrifice was not the end but the preparation. Inspiration does not come from victories handed to you easily. It comes from victories forged in the fire of your trials. It comes from learning that endurance is not weakness but strength in disguise. It comes from realizing that every time you were ignored, dismissed, or belittled, you were not being erased, you were being refined. And when the day came to rise, your resilience would shine brighter than the cruelty that once tried to bury you. I stood in that room not as a woman who had finally gotten revenge, but as a woman who had discovered that dignity can outlast mockery, that truth can outlast lies, and that faith can outlast fear. The shift of power was not about them losing, it was about me remembering who I had always been. I was not invisible. I was not weak. I was not in the way. I was the foundation, the strength, the one whose quiet patience had written the story they never saw coming. And this, I believe, is the lesson for anyone who has ever been underestimated. You are not defined by the voices that try to silence you. You are defined by the strength you carry when no one notices, by the faith that refuses to let go, by the resilience that keeps you standing even when the world pushes you down. Sometimes the greatest victories are not shouted, they are revealed in silence, in patience, in the quiet unveiling of truth that cannot be denied. So let this story remind you of something powerful. No matter how deeply others may try to bury you, seeds grow best in the dark. And one day, the same soil meant to hide you will become the ground from which you rise. Let their arrogance be their downfall, and let your endurance be your crown. You do not need to chase justice, it will find you when the time is right. And now I turn to you, the one listening to this story. Maybe you have been mocked. Maybe you have been ignored. Maybe you have been told you're nothing but a burden, nothing but someone in the way. But I want you to hear this clearly: you are more powerful than you know. You carry within you a strength that cannot be erased by cruelty, a dignity that cannot be destroyed by mockery, a faith that cannot be broken by fear. Hold on to that truth, because one day, the world will see it too. The people who doubted you will have no choice but to confront the echo of their own arrogance. The people who dismissed you will be forced to reckon with the truth they tried to ignore. And when that day comes, you will not need to shout or fight for recognition. The truth will speak louder than anything they ever said. And you will stand tall, not because you crushed them, but because you refused to let them crush you. Remember this: strength is not measured by how loudly you fight, but by how faithfully you endure. Dignity is not proven by their approval, but by your refusal to bow to their cruelty. And faith, the kind that carries you through the darkest nights, is what transforms humiliation into triumph. That is the legacy of resilience, the echo of endurance, the victory of those who never stop believing in themselves. If this story has touched you, if it has reminded you of your own strength, then let it be more than just words. Carry it with you into your own struggles. Let it fuel your courage. Let it remind you that no mockery lasts forever, and let it show you that sometimes the greatest blessing is being underestimated, because it gives you the power to rise when no one expects it. And as this story closes, I leave you with this: sometimes being pushed aside is the very thing that positions you to rise higher than you ever dreamed. Sometimes being ignored is the blessing that reveals your true worth. And sometimes being underestimated is the first step toward being unstoppable. If you believe in stories of resilience, dignity, and truth, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this message reach those who need courage the most. And stay close, because the next story will take you on another journey of betrayal, revelation, and justice, one that will remind you once again that faith always finds a way.